Some words are thrown into the air like confetti, bright, weightless, never meant to land anywhere. But sometimes those words drift until they find a place to settle, and from there they take root. This is the story of a joke that wasn't a joke and the man who decided to take it seriously. The sun was warm over Riverside Park, the annual charity fair already in full swing. Children darted between booths, the air thick with the smell of cotton candy and barbecue. At the far end of the green, Daniel Hayes tightened the last bolt on a makeshift stage. A carpenter by trade, he'd volunteered to help set up for the event. Sweat darkened the back of his gray t-shirt, but his hands moved with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. A few feet away, Mia Hayes, his 8-year-old daughter, sat cross-legged on the grass with a notebook. She was sketching intently, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth, the crude outline of a tree with a little house perched in its branches. A voice, warm but edged with playful confidence, drifted toward them. Charlotte playfully said, "That's ambitious, going to build that yourself." Daniel looked up to see Charlotte Vance, the Charlotte Vance, standing there in a tailored cream jumpsuit and oversized sunglasses. Billionaire CEO of Vance Properties, known for reshaping skylines, never for small talk at local fairs. Mia blinked at her, then held up the drawing. Mia proudly said, "It's my cloud house. You can see the sky from the roof." Charlotte tilted her head. Charlotte warmly said, "Cloud house, huh? Sounds magical." Then she turned to Daniel, a teasing glint in her eyes. Charlotte playfully said, "If you build me a treehouse like that, I'll marry you." A couple of volunteers nearby chuckled. It was the kind of thing people say when they're sure the other person won't take it seriously. Daniel didn't laugh. He set down his wrench, glanced at the tree Mia had been staring at all morning, and then back at Charlotte. Daniel quietly said, 2 days. The laughter around them died down. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Charlotte teasingly said, "You're not serious." Daniel quietly replied, "I don't say things I can't do." For a moment, Charlotte studied him, the quiet certainty in his tone, the way his daughter's eyes lit up at his words. She smirked as if to say, "We'll see." Charlotte playfully said, "All right, Mr. 2 days, surprise me." To Charlotte Vance, it was a throwaway line. To Daniel Hayes, it was a promise. And promises, especially the ones you make to a child, are worth keeping, even if the person you're building for never expects you to finish. Some men talk about what they can do. Others just show up with a tape measure. That afternoon, while the crowd at the fair moved on, Daniel Hayes was already thinking about lumber, ladders, and how to make a little girl's dream touch the clouds. By dawn the next morning, the park was quiet. The rides from the charity fair were gone, leaving the grass damp and indented. Daniel stood under the wide old oak Mia had been staring at yesterday, tape measure in hand, the cool metal clicking as he marked the trunk's girth. Mia sat on a nearby bench, kicking her legs, sipping hot chocolate from a paper cup. Mia sleepily said, "You're really doing it." Daniel quietly said, "Told you 2 days." He spent the morning mapping out the frame in a battered spiral notebook, angles, platform height, railing positions. He planned it so the treehouse would be safe, sturdy, but still high enough for Mia's cloud view. By noon, he was loading his old pickup with reclaimed cedar planks, a bucket of nails, rope, and a few sheets of corrugated roofing he'd been saving for the right project. At the Vance estate, Charlotte was on a business call when her housekeeper leaned in. Housekeeper softly said, "Miss Vance, the carpenter from the fair, he's out at the park. Looks like he's building something." Charlotte paused mid-sentence, her mind flashing back to his steady gaze and that quiet 2 days. Charlotte curiously said, "Really?" That afternoon, she drove herself down to the park, trading her usual chauffeured car for a vintage roadster. From a distance, she spotted Daniel up in the oak, drill buzzing, sawdust floating down in the sunlight. Mia sat cross-legged on a blanket below, handing up screws like a tiny foreman. Charlotte stayed by the fence, arms folded, watching. There was no grandstanding, no wasted movement, just the rhythm of someone who knew his craft and worked like time mattered. When he finally noticed her, he didn't stop. Just nodded once, then kept working. Charlotte called out, checking to see if you were serious. Daniel quietly replied, "Guess you found your answer." She smiled despite herself. Charlotte teasingly said, "Most people would have just laughed it off." Daniel quietly said, "Most people don't know how much a treehouse can mean to a kid." Her gaze shifted to Mia, who was carefully lining up a row of screws on the blanket. Something about the picture, father and daughter building together under the sun, softened Charlotte's posture. In Charlotte's world, buildings were made of steel, glass, and contracts. In Daniel's, they were made of wood, hands, and promises. And as she stood there watching, she began to wonder which kind lasted longer. Some people come closer out of curiosity. Others, because they're looking for something they don't know they've lost. That afternoon, Charlotte Vance crossed the park fence and unknowingly stepped into a story that wasn't hers yet. Charlotte left the shade of the fence and walked across the grass toward the oak. The sound of Daniel's hammering slowed as she approached, but he didn't stop completely. Mia glanced up from her blanket, squinting against the sun. Mia brightly said, "Hi, want some lemonade?" Charlotte crouched beside her, surprised to see a sweating glass pitcher tucked into the shade. Charlotte softly said, "You made this." Mia proudly said, "Dad says builders need fuel. I'm the fuel manager." Charlotte laughed, a sound she rarely heard from herself outside business dinners. She poured a cup and took a sip, the sweetness grounding her in the warm afternoon air. Charlotte warmly said, "It's perfect." Daniel climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on a rag. Daniel quietly said, "She's good at keeping things running." Charlotte teasingly said, "Like father, like daughter." He shrugged, a faint smile tugging his lips. They stood in the dappled shade, Charlotte noticing the careful way Daniel had chosen each plank. It wasn't just thrown together, it was crafted. Charlotte softly said, "You know, I wasn't serious when I said it." Daniel quietly replied, "Didn't matter. Mia took it seriously. That's enough for me." Charlotte looked at Mia again, her concentration as she lined up screws, her small hands passing tools without being asked. Charlotte softly said, "She's lucky." Daniel quietly said, "So am I." The moment lingered, the only sounds the breeze through the leaves and the faint clink of tools. Charlotte glanced up into the branches. Charlotte playfully said, "Think it'll really touch the clouds?" Daniel quietly said, "From up there, you'll feel like it." In Charlotte's circles, promises were made over contracts and signatures. Here, they were nailed into wood and rope. And as the afternoon sun leaned lower, she found herself wondering why the second felt more real. Deadlines mean one thing in business: pressure. In Daniel's world, they meant something else: trust. And 2 days after a careless joke in the park, the oak tree was no longer just a tree. It was a promise, built and standing. By the second afternoon, the treehouse stood proud against the late summer sky. A square of cedar planks nestled in the oak's arms, with a tiny balcony and a slanted roof that caught the sun like gold. A hand-painted sign hung above the door in crooked letters: "Cloud House, Mia's own handiwork." Charlotte arrived just as Daniel was fastening the last railing. She had no sunglasses today, no designer bag, just a simple blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back as if she didn't want to distract from the moment. Mia spotted her first. Mia excitedly said, "Come see, Dad says it's safe now." Charlotte followed her to the base of the ladder. Daniel stepped down, wiping his brow, then offered his hand. Daniel quietly said, "Ladies first." Charlotte climbed, the wooden rungs warm from the sun. When she reached the platform, her breath caught. From up here, the town's rooftops dipped away toward the river, the horizon stretching wide, clouds painted in soft shades of rose and cream. Charlotte softly said, "It's beautiful." Daniel joined her, standing just far enough to give her space, but close enough for his voice to be low. Daniel quietly said, "Told you it would feel like the sky." Mia scrambled up after them, her laughter filling the space. She leaned over the balcony, waving at the tiny people below. Mia proudly said, "Now it's real." Charlotte turned to Daniel, and for a moment she didn't see a challenge or a joke. She saw a man who had built something with his own hands simply because her daughter had dreamed it, and because he'd said he would. Charlotte softly said, "You really did it." Daniel quietly said, "I told you I don't make promises I can't keep." The air between them felt different now. The "marry me" she'd tossed out like a playful dare wasn't ringing in her ears as a joke anymore. In the quiet up there, surrounded by branches and sky, Charlotte felt something she hadn't in years safe. And Daniel, well, he'd built more than a treehouse. He de-built a bridge. Some invitations are about gratitude. Others are about curiosity. Charlotte Vance wasn't sure which one she'd sent, only that she wanted the man who built the cloud house to step into hers. The call came the next morning. Daniel was sanding a shelf in his workshop when Mia's voice echoed from the doorway. Mia excitedly said, "Dad, the lady says we're invited to dinner." Daniel set the sander down. Daniel quietly said, "The lady." Charlotte's voice floated from the phone Mia was holding out. Charlotte warmly said, "It's Charlotte. I thought you and Mia might like to join me tonight. Consider it a proper thank you." By 6 o'clock, Daniel's old pickup rolled past the iron gates of the Vance estate. The mansion rose behind manicured hedges, its glass walls catching the sunset in molten gold. Mia pressed her face to the window. Mia whispered, "It's like a palace." Daniel parked in the long driveway, cutting the engine. Daniel quietly said, "Remember, be polite, don't touch anything without asking," and Mia grinned, "I know. I'm the fuel manager, not a hurricane." Charlotte met them at the door herself. She wore a deep green dress that seemed to bring out the gold in her eyes. Charlotte softly said, "You clean up well, Mr. Hayes." Daniel quietly said, "You didn't see me this afternoon, covered in sawdust." She smiled, stepping aside to let them in. The dining room was a cathedral of light, crystal chandelier, a table long enough to seat 20, polished silver catching the candle glow. Mia's eyes widened, but Daniel kept his posture easy, unshaken. Dinner began warmly enough. Charlotte asked about Mia's school, her favorite books. Daniel shared bits of his work, his hands rough against the fine stemware. But halfway through the meal, the air shifted. Charlotte's younger brother, Oliver, strolled in late, still in a golf shirt. He dropped into a chair across from Daniel, sizing him up with a smirk. Oliver mockingly said, "So you're the famous treehouse man." Daniel quietly said, "Guess so." Oliver scoffed, "Must be nice, getting a free dinner for hammering a few nails." Charlotte's eyes flickered in warning, but Oliver kept going. Oliver lazily said, "Careful, Charlotte, you might end up with a charity case for a husband." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to it. Daniel quietly said, "I'm not here for a handout, I'm here because your sister asked." The silence that followed was sharp. Charlotte's gaze locked with her brother's, the message clear, enough. In Daniel's world, dignity wasn't a price you paid for company. And in Charlotte's, maybe for the first time, someone refused to let her wealth set the terms of the conversation. Some wounds don't bleed. They sit in the air after the words are spoken, waiting to be tended or ignored. Charlotte Vance was not the type to ignore them, especially when they were aimed at a man who had built something for her child's joy. Dinner ended early. Oliver had left after Charlotte's pointed look, muttering something about an early tea time. The staff began clearing dishes, but Charlotte asked Daniel and Mia to follow her outside. They stepped into the garden, a winding path of lavender and climbing roses glowing under soft lantern light. Mia skipped ahead toward the koi pond, leaving them in the quiet. Charlotte clasped her hands in front of her. Charlotte softly said, "I'm sorry about Oliver. He's used to a certain way of looking at people." Daniel's eyes followed Mia as she crouched near the water's edge, feeding koi from her palm. Daniel quietly said, "I've met his type before." Charlotte frowned, still it wasn't fair. Daniel quietly replied, "Life's not fair, Ms. Vance, but it's not the words that matter, it's what you do after them." She tilted her head, studying him. Charlotte softly said, "You're not easily shaken." Daniel quietly said, "If I was, Mia wouldn't have much of a father." That landed between them like a stone in still water, rippling out with unspoken weight. Mia turned from the pond, holding up a lily pad like treasure. Mia brightly said, "Dad, look at this one, it's perfect." Daniel took it from her gently. Daniel quietly said, "It is just like you." Charlotte smiled at the exchange, a warmth she couldn't quite hide creeping into her voice. Charlotte softly said, "She's everything to you, isn't she?" Daniel quietly said, "Everything and more." They walked back toward the house slowly, lantern light catching in Charlotte's hair. For the first time since she'd met him, she found herself wondering not just about his skills or his stubbornness, but the life behind his steady eyes. Sometimes respect is the first brick in something larger: trust, affection, maybe even love. That night in the hush of the garden, Charlotte placed her first brick. Bridges are strange things. They can be crossed in both directions, and sometimes the one who builds them is the first to be invited over. Charlotte Vance had walked into Daniel's world among sawdust and sunlight. Now she wanted him to see hers. 2 days later, Daniel's phone buzzed between sanding boards in his workshop. It was Charlotte. Charlotte warmly said, "I have a job for you, at Vance Innovations headquarters." Daniel hesitated. Daniel quietly said, "You know I'm not a corporate contractor." Charlotte playfully said, "Good. I'm not looking for one, I'm looking for you." She explained quickly. The company's rooftop terrace had been left unfinished after a previous designer walked out mid-project. She wanted Daniel to design and build a space where employees could take breaks, breathe, maybe even dream a little. Daniel quietly said, "Why me?" Charlotte softly replied, "Because you build more than wood and nails. You build places people want to be." The next morning, Daniel and Mia walked into the marble lobby of Vance Innovations. Employees glanced up, their eyes flicking over his flannel shirt and worn work boots. Mia clutched his hand, wide-eyed at the sheer size of the place. Charlotte appeared from the elevator, all sharp lines and quiet command in a tailored navy suit. Charlotte softly said, "Follow me." The rooftop was all raw potential: empty planters, half-assembled benches, and the skyline of the city stretching beyond glass railings. Daniel quietly said, "This could be something." Charlotte smiled, "That's why you're here." But as they walked the perimeter, two executives approached: Robert, the operations manager, and Elise, head of design. Robert's tone was clipped. Robert curtly said, "Ms. Vance, is this gentleman the contractor you've chosen?" Charlotte's brow tightened. Charlotte firmly said, "Yes, Robert, he's more than qualified." Robert muttered, "Looks like a liability to me." Daniel's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Charlotte stepped closer to Robert, her voice calm but edged. Charlotte coldly said, "If you can't see skill beyond a suit, perhaps you're in the wrong business." Robert walked away, Elise trailing after him. Daniel exhaled slowly. Daniel quietly said, "You didn't have to do that." Charlotte softly replied, "Yes, I did." In that moment, Daniel understood something. Charlotte's world might have been all glass and steel, but she wasn't afraid to stand on wood and nails when it mattered. Sometimes the real foundation isn't poured in daylight. It's built under the hum of city lights when the world feels smaller and people forget they're supposed to be strangers. The rooftop project began in full swing. Daniel arrived each morning with a plan sketched in pencil and ended each night covered in sawdust. Charlotte often appeared after hours, heels clicking against the deck boards, a coffee in each hand. Charlotte softly said, "You'll work yourself into the ground without these." Daniel quietly said, "It's not work if I'm building something worth having." One evening, a storm rolled through just as Daniel was fastening the last railing section. Rain drummed against the unfinished wood. Charlotte stood at the edge, her hair damp, watching the city blur into watercolor below. Charlotte softly said, "When I was a kid, I wanted a place like this, somewhere above everything but not alone." Daniel set his drill aside. Daniel quietly said, "And now you're building it." She smiled faintly. Charlotte whispered, "Number you're building it." They stayed late, talking under the half-built pergola. Charlotte told him about the years she spent trying to prove she could run her father's company. Daniel shared stories of Mia, her stubbornness, her love for books, the nights he'd stayed awake fixing furniture for neighbors just to afford her birthday cake. Charlotte softly said, "You've done everything for her." Daniel quietly replied, "That's what parents do." At one point, Mia wandered onto the rooftop, rubbing her eyes. She had fallen asleep in Charlotte's office, waiting for her dad. Mia mumbled, "Dad, are you done yet?" Daniel quietly said, "Almost, kiddo." Charlotte knelt to her level. Charlotte warmly said, "You know, when this place is finished, you'll be the first to try it out." Mia grinned sleepily. Mia said, "Can we put a swing up here?" Charlotte glanced at Daniel, almost daring him to say no. Daniel quietly said, "Guess I'm building a swing." A swing on a rooftop. To some, it was just wood and rope. To others, it was proof that even in the highest towers, you could still find a piece of home. Some projects end when the last nail is driven. Others begin there. Daniel thought he was just finishing a job. Charlotte knew better. 2 weeks later, the rooftop terrace was done. Benches lined with cedar, planters bursting with lavender and ivy, the pergola casting soft shade over a small seating area. At the far corner, a wooden swing hung from thick braided rope, Mia's request, honored to the last detail. Charlotte invited the entire staff for the unveiling. The late afternoon light spilled across the skyline, glass buildings glowing gold. Employees stepped onto the rooftop, gasping at the transformation. Employee whispered, "Feels like another world up here." Charlotte stood near the swing, wearing a white summer dress instead of her usual power suit. Her eyes kept finding Daniel in the crowd, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly messy, watching people enjoy what he'd built. She stepped toward him. Charlotte softly said, "It's perfect." Daniel quietly said, "It's just wood and plants." Charlotte shook her head. "It's more than that. You've given them a place to breathe." As the staff mingled, Mia tugged on Charlotte's hand. Mia brightly said, "Come swing with me." Charlotte hesitated, then laughed and sat beside the girl, their feet kicking gently in the air. From where he stood, Daniel couldn't help smiling. Later, as the guests began to leave, Charlotte approached him again, her voice lower now. Charlotte softly said, "Do you remember what I said in the park about marrying you if you built the treehouse?" Daniel's brow lifted slightly. Daniel quietly said, "Vaguely." Charlotte smiled faintly, "I think I underestimated you." Daniel quietly replied, "And now?" Her gaze lingered on him for a long beat. Charlotte softly said, "Now I'm wondering what else you could build if I let you." It was half a tease, half a truth, and Daniel knew enough about building to recognize when a foundation was being laid. Some invitations come printed on thick paper. Others are spoken quietly in the kind of moment where both people know something is shifting, even if neither says it outright. The rooftop unveiling ended, but Charlotte didn't let Daniel slip away. As Mia leaned sleepily against her father's side, Charlotte stepped closer. Charlotte softly said, "Come with me, both of you." Daniel hesitated. Daniel quietly said, "Where?" Charlotte smiled faintly, "Home." They rode the elevator down in silence. The company driver was waiting, opening the sleek black car door for them. Mia's eyes widened at the plush leather seats, her small hands tracing the stitching. Mia whispered, "Dad, is this safe?" Daniel quietly said, "Safe enough." Charlotte glanced at him, catching the note of humor in his tone. Her home sat on a hill outside the city, a blend of glass and warm stone, its wide windows reflecting the last streaks of sunset. Inside, the air smelled faintly of jasmine and cedar. Mia drifted toward the grand piano in the corner, running her fingers over the keys without pressing them. Charlotte softly said, "Do you play?" Mia shook her head, "No, but I want to." Charlotte's gaze softened. Dinner was simple but warm: pasta, fresh bread, and slices of lemon cake. They ate in the sunroom, light spilling in from the city beyond. Halfway through, Mia excused herself to explore the garden, leaving Daniel and Charlotte alone. Charlotte quietly said, "You've been in my world twice now, first the rooftop, now this. I think it's time I see more of yours." Daniel quietly replied, "Mine isn't made of glass and stone." Charlotte softly said, "Good, I'm tired of glass." Later, as they walked Daniel and Mia to the car, Charlotte paused at the gate. Charlotte softly said, "This doesn't have to be the end of a job unless you want it to be." Daniel studied her for a long moment, the night air cool around them. Daniel quietly said, "We'll see." But the small smile at the corner of his mouth said otherwise. It's a dangerous thing, opening the door between two lives. Once it's open, you can't help but wonder what it would feel like to step all the way through. Some walls come down with a crash. Others fall piece by piece, pulled apart by small, unexpected kindnesses. Charlotte didn't know it yet, but Mia had just found the first brick. 2 days later, Charlotte drove herself, no driver, no assistance, to Daniel's small rental house on the edge of town. She didn't call first. She wanted to see him as he was, without preparation. The yard was simple: a patch of grass, a leaning fence, and a little tree that had been there long before Daniel moved in. Mia sat beneath it, crayons scattered, sketching on rough paper. Charlotte softly said, "Hey, artist." Mia looked up and grinned. Mia brightly said, "Hi, Charlotte, I'm drawing something for you." Charlotte blinked. Charlotte quietly asked, "For me?" Mia nodded and held up the paper, a colorful picture of the rooftop terrace, complete with the swing. At the top, in careful block letters, "Thank you for letting my dad build magic." Charlotte crouched to Mia's level, her voice gentler than she intended. Charlotte softly said, "This is beautiful, can I keep it?" Mia nodded, "Only if you promise to come swing with me again." Charlotte smiled, a real smile, when she didn't often let people see. Daniel emerged from the side of the house, wiping his hands on a rag. His shirt had flecks of paint, and there was a smudge of sawdust on his cheek. Daniel quietly said, "You found us." Charlotte replied lightly, "Wasn't hard. The rooftop swing gave me the address." He chuckled softly, leaning against the fence. Charlotte added, "I wanted to bring you something." She handed him a slim black envelope. Inside was a check, more than what they had agreed for the rooftop. Daniel quietly said, "This is too much." Charlotte firmly replied, "No, this is what it's worth." Mia tugged on Charlotte's hand again. Mia said, You should see the treehouse Dad's building for me in the backyard." Charlotte glanced at Daniel, one brow lifting. Daniel quietly said, "It's not finished yet." Charlotte softly replied, "Neither was the rooftop when you let me see it." And just like that, the lines between client, friend, and something else blurred, not with grand gestures, but with drawings, swings, and the kind of invitations you can't buy. Some people think the measure of a man is in what he owns. Others can see it in how he holds a hammer when no one's watching. Charlotte returned 3 days later. The sound of hammering echoed from the backyard. Mia met her at the gate, barefoot, a smear of peanut butter on her cheek. Mia brightly said, "You're just in time, he's almost at the roof." Charlotte followed her, stepping into a scene she didn't expect. Daniel was up in the half-built treehouse, steady on the wooden beams. The sunlight cut across his face, his shirt sticking slightly to his back from the heat. He didn't notice her at first, too focused, too careful with every nail. Mia cupped her hands and called out. Mia shouted, "Dad, your boss is here." Daniel glanced down, smirking faintly. Daniel quietly said, "She's not my boss, not today." Charlotte tilted her head, a smile tugging at her lips. Charlotte softly said, "So what am I today?" He shrugged, returning to his work. Daniel quietly said, "An unexpected audience." Mia climbed up the short ladder, settling beside her father with no fear. Charlotte felt an ache in her chest, watching the way he steadied her with one arm while still hammering with the other. Mia glanced at Charlotte. Mia said, "You know, Dad can fix anything, even hearts." Daniel froze mid-swing of the hammer. Charlotte blinked, caught off guard. Charlotte softly asked, "Who told you that?" Mia shrugged. "I just did." Daniel cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Daniel quietly said, "Mia, why don't you show Charlotte where the swing's going to hang?" Mia hopped down eagerly. Charlotte lingered a moment, her gaze still on Daniel. Charlotte softly said, "You really can't help yourself, can you?" He looked down at her. Daniel quietly asked, "Help myself with what?" Charlotte replied, "Building things people didn't even know they needed, until you gave it to them." It wasn't a compliment about wood or nails. It was about him, and Daniel knew it. That's why it stuck with him long after she left that day. Some nights are just nights, others are stages, and when you step onto them, the whole world suddenly decides it's watching. The invitation came in an embossed envelope, heavy in Daniel's hands. Inside, gold lettering announced, "Charlotte Hayes Annual Charity Gala, black tie required." At the bottom in her handwriting, "Bring Mia, don't argue." On the night of the gala, Daniel wore his only suit, pressed but a little outdated. Mia wore a soft blue dress Charlotte had sent earlier that week, with matching shoes. When they stepped into the hotel ballroom, the light was warm, the air alive with music and laughter. Crystal chandeliers reflected over polished marble floors. Waiters moved like clockwork, carrying trays of champagne and sparkling cider. Charlotte approached, radiant in a floor-length silver gown that caught every flicker of light. Charlotte softly said, "You clean up well." Daniel quietly said, "You sent the dress for Mia. Guess you were hoping I'd rise to the occasion." She smiled faintly. Charlotte replied, "You didn't disappoint." Mia's eyes were wide as she took in the room. Mia whispered, "Dad, I've never seen so many spoons on one table." Daniel chuckled softly. Daniel quietly said, "Me neither." Charlotte bent down to Mia's height. Charlotte softly said, "I'll teach you which one's for dessert later." The evening moved between speeches, auctions, and soft jazz. Daniel stayed near Charlotte, feeling the weight of eyes on them, curious, assessing. At one point, a man in a tailored suit approached. Man said smoothly, "Charlotte, introduce me to your guest." Charlotte's hand brushed Daniel's arm as she spoke. Charlotte firmly said, "This is Daniel. He built the rooftop terrace at my company. And this is his daughter, Mia. She's the reason it has a swing." The man nodded politely, but Daniel caught the faint smirk before he walked away. Later, during the final dance set, Charlotte turned to Daniel. Charlotte softly said, "Dance with me." Daniel quietly said, "I don't dance." Charlotte replied, "You build tree houses, you can dance." He hesitated, then took her hand. It wasn't about the dance. It was about showing the room that they belonged there together, even if no one else understood why. A crowded room can feel safe until the one person you're watching over suddenly isn't there anymore. The dance ended, applause washing over the room. Daniel turned toward the table where Mia had been, but her chair was empty. Daniel quietly said, "Mia." Charlotte's head snapped around. Charlotte softly said, "She was just here." Daniel was already moving, scanning the crowd. The ballroom was a swirl of gowns and suits, faces blending together. He wove through them, checking near the dessert table the coat check, the rows of silent auction items. "No, Mia." Charlotte caught up to him, heels clicking on the marble. Charlotte firmly said, "Split up. You check the lobby, I'll take the garden." Daniel pushed through the doors into the lobby, his chest tightening. Then a flicker of blue in the corner. Mia was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the grand piano, chatting with the elderly pianist. Daniel quietly said, "Mia, you scared me." Mia looked up innocently. "I was just listening to music. He's teaching me the start of a song." The pianist smiled apologetically. Pianist softly said, "She has a good ear." Charlotte appeared in the doorway, relief flooding her expression. She knelt beside Mia. Charlotte softly said, "Next time tell us before you wander off, okay?" Mia nodded sheepishly. Daniel extended his hand. Daniel quietly said, "Come on, let's go back." As they walked, Charlotte stayed close to Daniel. Charlotte quietly said, "You didn't panic like I thought you would." Daniel replied, "I did, I just didn't let it show." She studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. Charlotte softly said, "You're good under pressure." Daniel quietly said, "When it comes to her, I have to be." It wasn't just about finding Mia. It was about Charlotte seeing, for the first time, the way Daniel moved through fear, steady, quiet, but never still. Some promises are made out loud. Others are built in silence, nail by nail, waiting for the right person to notice. The next weekend, Charlotte drove up to Daniel's place without calling. She found him in the backyard, standing under the old tree. Above him, the treehouse was finished, warm wood, smooth edges, a small balcony wrapped with rope railing. Mia was inside, arranging pillows and a blanket. Charlotte stepped closer, craning her neck. Charlotte softly said, "It's beautiful." Daniel gave a modest shrug. Daniel quietly said, "It's hers. She designed most of it." Charlotte replied, "You made it real." He offered her a hand. Daniel quietly said, "Come see the inside." She hesitated, heels weren't exactly ladder-friendly, but she took off her shoes and climbed. Inside, sunlight streamed through a small round window. There was a low shelf with Mia's books, a tiny table, and in the corner, a wooden box. Charlotte knelt and opened it. Inside were 3 compartments, one with Mia's crayons, one with photos of her and Daniel, and one empty, except for a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. It was a sketch, a rooftop terrace with a swing. On the bottom, in careful handwriting, "For Charlotte if she ever needs a place to breathe." Charlotte looked up at him, her throat tight. Charlotte softly said, "You made me a place here." Daniel leaned against the wall, hands in his pockets. Daniel quietly said, "Not yet, but I could." Her fingers traced the lines of the drawing. Charlotte whispered, "You don't even know what that means to me." Daniel replied, maybe I do. Mia's voice floated in from outside. Mia called Dad, can Charlotte stay for dinner? Charlotte smiled faintly, eyes still on Daniel. Charlotte softly said, well, can I? He nodded once. Daniel quietly said, yeah, stay. And maybe, just maybe, the treehouse wasn't the only thing Daniel had been building all along. Some houses are big enough to fit 100 people and still feel empty. Others are small enough that elbows bump at dinner, but somehow, that's where the heart feels full. Daniel's kitchen wasn't fancy. The table was scuffed, the chairs mismatched. But as Charlotte stepped inside, she caught the scent of garlic and rosemary, and something about it made her chest loosen. Mia was setting the table, 2 plates already in place, now adding a third without asking permission. Mia brightly said, you're sitting next to me, Charlotte. Charlotte smiled, I'd be honored. Daniel pulled a tray from the oven. Roast chicken, golden potatoes, steamed carrots. It wasn't plated like a 5-star meal, it was better. It was real. Charlotte softly said, you cook. Daniel quietly said, keeps us alive. They sat, Mia launching into a story about her day at school. Daniel listened with that half-smile he always wore around her, occasionally nodding, occasionally cutting her chicken into smaller bites without missing a beat in the conversation. Charlotte found herself watching them more than eating. Mia suddenly said, Charlotte, what's your favorite thing to do after work? Charlotte blinked, caught off guard. Charlotte replied, honestly, lately it's coming here. Daniel's fork paused for just a second. Daniel quietly said, that's unexpected. Charlotte teased, is it? Daniel replied, you could be anywhere, why here? She met his gaze. Charlotte softly said, because here no one's keeping score. After dinner, Mia insisted on showing Charlotte her bedtime story routine. Daniel read aloud, while Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, listening. When Mia drifted off, Charlotte lingered in the doorway as Daniel pulled the blanket over her. Charlotte softly said, you make this place feel like home. Daniel quietly said, it is home for her, that's all that matters. Charlotte stepped closer. Charlotte whispered, you don't realize you've made it feel like that for me too. And somewhere between dinner and the last page of a bedtime story, a woman with everything realized she wanted something she couldn't buy. Some things grow best in the quiet, but sooner or later the noise comes looking for you. It started with a camera flash. Daniel barely noticed it at first. They were leaving the small neighborhood cafe, Mia holding both their hands. But by the time they reached his truck, a man with a press badge was standing there, phone already recording. Reporter said quickly, Ms. Hayes, are you and Mr. Miller together? Is this your daughter? Charlotte froze. Charlotte firmly said, no comment. Daniel opened the truck door for Mia, shielding her from the questions. Daniel quietly said, let's go. By nightfall, Charlotte's name was on half a dozen gossip sites. CEO Hayes seen with single dad, mystery girl identified. From boardroom to backyard, Charlotte Hayes knew life. Her office phone wouldn't stop ringing. Investors wanted reassurance. PR teams wanted a statement. But she hadn't even figured out what to say to Daniel. She showed up at his door that evening, tension in every movement. Charlotte softly said, you've seen it. Daniel quietly said, yeah. Charlotte replied, this isn't how I wanted this to happen. Daniel shrugged slightly, we didn't do anything wrong. Charlotte softly said, in my world that doesn't always matter. Mia peeked from the hallway. Mia asked, are they mad at us? Charlotte crouched down, brushing Mia's hair back. Charlotte softly said, no, sweetheart, they just like talking about things that aren't their business. Mia frowned. Mia replied, that's silly. Daniel gave a small smile. Daniel quietly said, "It is." It wasn't the headlines that scared Charlotte. It was what they might take from her if she didn't protect this new life she'd stumbled into. Sometimes the only way to stop the story they're telling is to start telling your own. Charlotte didn't wait for her PR team's permission. That morning, she arrived at the annual charity gala, cameras flashing, not in her usual diamond necklace and silk gown, but in a simple navy dress. And she didn't walk in alone. Daniel, in a pressed shirt, held Mia's hand on one side. Charlotte held it on the other. The whispers started before they even reached the entrance. A reporter stepped forward. Reporter asked, "Ms. Hayes care to comment on the rumors?" Charlotte paused, looking straight into the nearest camera. Charlotte clearly said, "Yes, this is Daniel Miller, and this is Mia. They're part of my life, and I'm proud of that." The murmurs rippled through the crowd. Daniel glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Daniel quietly said, "You didn't have to." Charlotte softly said, "Yes, I did." Inside the ballroom, people stared. Some with curiosity, some with disapproval. Charlotte didn't flinch. She introduced Daniel to the board members, to donors, to the same CEOs who used to compete for her attention at these events. Mia stayed close, clutching her small clutch purse like a treasure. At one point, she whispered to Daniel. Mia softly said, "They're all looking." Daniel quietly said, "Let them, we know who we are." Halfway through the evening, Charlotte was called to the stage to speak. She stood at the microphone, scanning the crowd, then let her gaze rest on Daniel and Mia. Charlotte said into the mic, "In business, they tell you to protect your assets, to keep things separate. But the truth is, the best things in my life aren't things. They're people, and sometimes you find them where you least expect." Daniel's jaw tightened, not from discomfort, but from holding back emotion. And just like that, Charlotte rewrote the headline, not with damage control, but with truth. When you stand for something, the ground beneath you always shakes first. The morning after the gala, Charlotte's phone was already vibrating when she woke. Her assistant's voice came through before she could even say hello. Assistant hurriedly said, "The board wants an emergency meeting. Noon, they're not happy." Charlotte glanced toward her kitchen. Daniel was making pancakes with Mia, their laughter spilling into the quiet morning like it belonged there. Charlotte softly said, "I'll be there." At the boardroom table, it began. Board member 1 said, "Your personal life is now on the front page. Investors are asking questions." Charlotte replied evenly, "Then answer them. Tell them I'm still running the company." Board member 2 said, "And the man, the child, it looks unprofessional." Charlotte's jaw tightened. Charlotte said, "They are not part of my business, but they are part of my life, and I don't apologize for that." Meanwhile, Daniel got a taste of the storm himself. At the hardware store, 2 strangers whispered loud enough for him to hear. Man whispered, "That's the guy, the one with the CEO." Daniel paid for the lumber, kept his eyes forward. But the moment he got home, Charlotte's car pulled in. Daniel quietly said, "How bad was it?" Charlotte exhaled, "They think you're a distraction, something I need to manage." Daniel leaned against the counter, silent for a moment. Daniel quietly said, "If being in my life costs you everything you've built." Charlotte interrupted, Don't finish that sentence." Mia appeared in the doorway, sensing the tension. Mia softly said, "Are they mad at us again?" Charlotte knelt, taking her small hands. Charlotte softly said, "No, honey, they're just slow to understand." And maybe that was the truth. Some people never understand. But others, they just need to see that love can hold steady, even in a storm. Sometimes the one they least expect to belong walks in and changes the whole room. The next board meeting wasn't supposed to include Daniel. But that morning, Charlotte arrived to find him waiting in the lobby, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that clearly hadn't been tailored for him, yet somehow looked exactly right. Charlotte softly said, "What are you doing here?" Daniel quietly said, "You stood in my world. I figured it's time I stand in yours." Inside, the room buzzed with tension. The board members, all polished in their power seats, went still when Daniel walked in behind Charlotte. Board member 1 said, "And this is?" Charlotte replied, "Daniel Miller. You've all read about him. I thought you should meet him before you judge him." One of the more skeptical members smirked. Board member 2 said, "Mr. Miller, what exactly is it you do?" Daniel didn't blink. Daniel quietly said, "I build, with my hands, with my time, with what I've got. Tree houses for kids, decks for neighbors, anything that lasts longer than I do." A hush fell. Daniel continued, "I've seen people with more money than sense, and people with nothing who give everything. Charlotte, she's one of the few who knows the difference. If you think being in her life will slow her down, you don't know her." Charlotte's throat tightened. By the time the meeting ended, no one dared use the word distraction again. As they stepped into the hallway, Charlotte looked at him. Charlotte softly said, "You didn't have to do that." Daniel quietly said, "Yeah, I did." That night back at his house, Mia listened as Charlotte told the story. When Daniel tucked her in, she grinned. Mia said, "So, you fought for her like she fought for us?" Daniel smiled faintly. Daniel quietly said, "Exactly." And just like that, the lines between their worlds blurred until there was no line at all. Homes aren't just addresses. Sometimes they're a room in a tree, a swing on a rooftop, or a promise someone made and kept. On a quiet night under a handful of stars, 3 people finally saw the same home at once. The sun slid down behind the roofs, leaving the backyard washed in blue. Daniel stood beneath the oak with a box of paper lanterns and a spool of twine. Mia bounced in place, slippers tapping the grass. Charlotte arrived with a bakery box and a sweater thrown over her shoulders. Charlotte softly said, "What's all this?" Daniel quietly said, "Housewarming, Cloud House Edition." He handed Mia a lantern. Daniel quietly said, "You pick where they go, Captain's orders." Mia gasped, climbed the ladder, and began clipping little moons of light along the balcony rail. The treehouse glowed, the wood turning honey warm. Inside, Daniel had added one last detail. A narrow shelf with 3 carved names burned into the edge, Mia, Daniel, Charlotte. The third name was lighter, newer, careful. Charlotte touched the letters with her fingertips. Charlotte whispered, "You carved this." Daniel quietly said, "Didn't want you knocking forever." She laughed under her breath, but her eyes were wet. They shared the bakery cake on tin plates, legs dangling from the balcony, the lanterns swaying like small planets. Mia brightly said, "We need a rule. If you're sad, you come up here until you're not." Charlotte smiled. "That might be my new favorite law." Daniel quietly said, "Seconded." A breeze moved through the leaves, making the lights flicker and the moment settle deeper. After cake, Mia curled up on the quilt and drifted, lantern light on her cheek. Charlotte pulled the sweater around her and watched the little rise and fall of Mia's breath. Charlotte softly said, "I was always building up taller towers, bigger numbers. I forgot there's another way to build." Daniel quietly asked, "Which way is that?" Charlotte replied, "Closer, not higher." He looked at her for a long moment. Daniel quietly said, "Then stay close." She didn't answer with words. She slid her hand over his on the rail, small, certain. The tree creaked the way old friends do, like it approved. From the yard below, the house looked different. A humble roofline, a glowing tree, and 2 silhouettes holding a quiet promise. You can chase the skyline all your life and still miss the lanterns in your own branches. That night, they didn't. Every home, no matter how strong the walls or high the branches, will one day face a knock it didn't expect. It was the third evening after the lantern night. Mia was upstairs in the treehouse, drawing by flashlight. Daniel was fixing the back fence. Charlotte, in the kitchen, was setting out mugs for tea when the doorbell rang. Not a soft, neighborly ring. A long, deliberate one. She opened the door and froze. On the porch stood Edward Langston, her ex-fiancé, all-pressed navy suit and a smirk that used to charm shareholders, but now just made the air feel colder. Charlotte stiffly said, "Edward, what do you want?" Edward smoothly said, "To talk about all this." He gestured past her toward the yard, the faint glow of the treehouse visible through the window. Charlotte said, "You should leave." Daniel appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a rag. Daniel quietly said, "Evening." Edward's smile tightened. Edward said, "You must be the carpenter." Daniel quietly said, "And you must be the one who didn't stay." A pause thick enough to taste. Edward said, "Charlotte, you've worked too hard to throw it away for." Charlotte cut in, "For someone who shows up when it matters? Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing." Mia's voice floated down from the treehouse balcony. Mia called, "Dad, who's that?" Daniel glanced up, then back at Edward. Daniel quietly said, "That's someone who was just leaving." Edward's eyes flickered, a mix of recognition and the smallest hint of defeat. Edward said, "You're making a mistake." Charlotte replied, "I've made plenty, this isn't one of them." She shut the door. The click was louder than the ring had been. Back in the kitchen, Daniel poured the tea she'd set out. Daniel quietly said, "Sorry you had to deal with that." Charlotte softly said, "Don't be. It reminded me why I left that world in the first place." Sometimes the past knocks, not because it misses you, but because it hates that you've moved on. Close the door anyway. Every promise starts as a handful of words, but the ones that last, they're carved into more than wood, they're carved into the life you've built together. 2 days after Edward's visit, the air was sharp with early autumn. Mia was at a sleepover, and the house felt too quiet. Daniel asked Charlotte to meet him at the treehouse after sunset. No explanation, just that. When she climbed the ladder, she stopped at the doorway. Inside, the lanterns were lit again. Only this time, dozens more lined the walls. Photos of the three of them hung from string. Messy breakfasts, fence-painting afternoons, and one of Mia asleep on Daniel's shoulder. In the center sat the carved shelf. But now, under the names, a small wooden box waited. Charlotte softly said, "What is this?" Daniel quietly said, "You once laughed and said if I built you a treehouse, you'd marry me." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, silver, but etched with tiny leaves like the ones outside the window. Daniel quietly said, "I built the treehouse. I built the life that goes with it. Now I'm asking if you want the rest of it too." Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth. For a second, she could only stare. Charlotte softly said, "Daniel." Daniel quietly said, "This isn't a bet, or a joke, or a dare. It's me telling you I'm done building things without you in them." She stepped forward, took the ring, and slid it on. Charlotte whispered, "Yes." The word hung in the lantern glow, small but strong enough to shift the air. They sat on the floor, backs against the wall, watching the leaves stir outside the open window. Neither spoke much after that. They didn't need to. Some vows don't wait for the altar. They're spoken in tree houses under lanterns with the kind of yes that changes every chapter after it. The best endings aren't really endings. They're just the part where everyone decides to stay. It was late September, the air soft and gold. Guests gathered in the backyard, rows of chairs facing the oak tree, the same tree that had held the first promise. The treehouse above was draped in white fabric and fairy lights. Mia had insisted. She stood proudly in a little cream dress, a bouquet clutched in her hands like treasure. Daniel stood at the altar wearing a simple gray suit, hands steady but heart hammering. When Charlotte appeared at the back door, the sunlight caught in her hair, and every conversation stopped. Daniel quietly said, "You're everything." She smiled as she walked toward him, step by step, the yard narrowing until it was just the two of them. The efficient began, but Mia couldn't wait. Mia called out, "Can I say something?" Everyone laughed, and the efficient nodded. Mia turned to Charlotte. Mia brightly said, "You made my dad smile again. You made our house feel like a home. So I'm glad you're my mom now." Charlotte's eyes shimmered. When it was time for vows, Daniel cleared his throat. Daniel quietly said, "I built the treehouse for you, Charlotte, but I think you built the rest, the part that matters. I promise to keep building as long as I get to do it with you." Charlotte's voice shook when she answered. Charlotte softly said, "I came here thinking I'd give you a job. Instead, you gave me a life. I promise to protect it and you for the rest of mine." They exchanged rings under the oak. The crowd clapped. But when Daniel kissed her, the sound faded into the rustle of leaves and the creak of the treehouse above. Some people chase towers and penthouses, but the happiest ones, they find a branch strong enough to hold there forever. It started with a dare, a laugh, a throwaway line about wood and nails, but sometimes the smallest challenge becomes the blueprint for a life you didn't even know you were missing. The seasons rolled on. The oak stood through wind and frost, its leaves falling and growing back again. The treehouse lanterns came on every evening, not because they needed light, but because some lights should never go out. Mia grew taller. Her drawings filled the walls upstairs. Daniel's hands still carried the roughness of a builder, but now they also carried Charlotte's hand wherever they went. Charlotte learned that love didn't have to be earned in boardrooms, only nurtured in quiet backyards. Sometimes neighbors walking home at night would pause by the fence and see the glow in the tree, the laughter drifting down, the shapes of three people sitting close. They didn't know the whole story, but they could tell whatever it was, it ended well. So, dear listener, build the treehouse, plant the garden, string the lights, not because someone dares you, but because one day someone you love will call it home, and that will be your forever.